If you want someone who is a truth-telling leader, who will lead with integrity and transparency and common sense conservatism, then I am your candidate, hands down.
What's up, guys? Corey Allen here, the Overton Report and the Overton Group. We're here with Ellen Weaver. She is one of the two people who made it to the Republican primary runoff for the State Superintendent of Education. And we are here to talk about some of the differences between her and her runoff opponent. How are you doing, Ellen?
I'm great, Corey. Great to be with you today.
Good. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we start, I've got to say, we have asked Kathy Manis, your opponent, some questions, and her response was to block everybody that is involved with the Overton Group, from Columbia to Pickens to Greenville to Myrtle Beach to Charleston. So we really, that's one point in your favor already. Thank you for joining us and answering some of these questions.
Yeah, no, glad to be here. Conversation is where it all starts.
For sure. So I want to touch on a number of things. And these are going to be questions that the people that I've spoke to, the people that follow us and watch our content, have asked us to get some clarification or figure out where you stand on some of these things. The first thing that I want to talk to you about is the idea of critical race theory influencing not only teachers in the classroom, but also this continuing ed that a lot of teachers are made to go to, which I think when the teachers are taught this stuff, it's going to be in the classroom no matter what, that they can't help but do it because they're trained to. So what are your thoughts on critical race theory, that whole critical ideology? And also, what is your response to some of the people who will tell you that it doesn't even exist?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, I want to say that I oppose any kind of woke indoctrination like critical theory in our public education system. It is just not the place of our public schools to take positions on political issues, especially when they touch on some of the most deeply held values that really belong to parents, to families, and to faith communities. Our public education system is there to teach our children the basics of an education that they need to be successful. And so when you look at issues like CRT, it really just frustrates me to death when I feel like people really gaslight conservatives and others who say that there is CRT in our schools, because you don't have to have the acronym CRT in a textbook or in a supplemental resource for it to be guided by the ideology that underlies CRT. And let's be clear, it's a worldview. And this is not me saying this. This is scholars who support that kind of woke worldview. I mean, I have read the peer-reviewed scholarly papers of people who talk about what are the underpinnings of what they call critical pedagogy. It's not just CRT, it's much larger than that. It gets into gender ideology, it gets into sexual orientation ideology. I mean, there is a broad spectrum of things that fall under this critical pedagogy approach. And so, it has been in our colleges of higher education for decades now. And how could it not filter down into K-12 education when, the teachers are being trained in this critical pedagogy in higher education? Now, I do want to hasten to say, though, that teachers, to your earlier point, are oftentimes the victims of this as well, because they are being forced to go to trainings and professional developments that are shaped by this worldview, whether they believe it or not. You also, in a lot of cases, you have what I call the DE&I industrial complex that comes into these school districts and says, we need to do a DE&I audit here to see whether you are inclusive and diverse enough. And so, surprise, surprise, they find that you are not, and then they sell you their services to help, make you what they say you need to be. And so a lot of times this is happening on taxpayer dollars. And, it's just crazy because I think that there's a broad spectrum of people across the political divide in our country who don't believe it's the place of public education to be getting into these political questions. And so as superintendent, I want to protect our students and our teachers from this
Okay.
kind of forced ideology.
Absolutely. And for those who don't know, DE&I is diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's like a lot of things that stem from these type of pedagogies, like you said, come with flowery language, so that if a person speaks out against a program with this flowery term, diversity, equity, and inclusion, they're gaslit, like you said, and told, oh, so you don't believe in diversity? It's like, no, I just don't believe in, this leftist or this insane solution to a problem that may or may not even exist in the first place. So they're coming at these things from this very politically motivated ideology, right? And that's why things like DEI, CRT, the influence of it can be such a dangerous thing. You touched on gender ideology. That is something that a lot of people are concerned about right now because of federal education dollars from the Biden administration being tied to allowing boys in women's bathrooms and girls' bathrooms in school if they feel that they're a girl, right? So what can the state of South Carolina, what can the state superintendent do with something like that?
Well, I'll tell you, the state superintendent can't stand alone. It's going to take the General Assembly, it's going to take the governor, and it's going to take building a coalition of people who care about protecting our children from these radical ideologies that are coming out of Washington. Saying no to federal dollars is probably the place to start. And we will have to have a conversation about what that means for how we fund education in this state. But I truly believe we are coming to a moment of crisis where we've been able to just kind of bump along and say, okay. I mean, we know we only get 10% of our total education budget from the federal government right now.
Is that
But
right?
yeah, but it probably comes with, 50% of the strings, right? All of the red tape that teachers are talking about, all of the compliance costs and everything, that are tied to federal dollars are incredibly labor intensive. So, federal dollars right now, a lot of them support special education, and it also supports children in poverty. So those are very real questions about how do we continue to fund them if we say no to federal dollars. And that's a conversation that has to be had in conjunction with the General Assembly. I know Superintendent Zase during his tenure tried to say no to federal dollars. And of course, there was the predictable outrage, oh, you hate children, trying to deny children opportunity. So, I mean, I understand there's a huge public awareness and public grassroots mobilization that's going to have to happen if we are to stand up and say no to federal dollars as a state. But I believe it starts with having a superintendent courageous enough to make the case.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about that actually. Molly Spearman, and she currently is facing some ethics issues with her using her office to support your opponent in the primary and the runoff. We'll see where that goes. In 2020 and 2021, we saw schools shut down. We saw children isolated. We saw children having to wear marks if they refused to get their vaccine. We documented that at the Overton Report. We'll put some links in this so people can see it. Those kids, if they couldn't wear a mask, for example, were forced to go into a room. Maybe it was the lunchroom, maybe it was the library. What would you have been able to do or have done different if you were in the position that Spearman was in? Because it seemed like she passed the buck and said, there's nothing I can do and I will just stay out of it. Is that right? Was that the right decision, or what, what could you do?
I think, early on March 2020, there were so many questions that we just didn't know the answers to. So when the governor said we were going to close schools, I think everyone went along with it, because we just didn't know.
Mhm.
By the fall of 2020, we had science from other countries as well as from here that made it clear that children were at the lowest risk of transmission and of serious illness. And so the fact that science out of Washington was politicized all over this country to keep classrooms closed and to instill fear in citizens is
Mhm.
really one of the greatest scandals, I think, of my lifetime. And the damage that has been done to children as a result of that is something that we're going to be recovering from for the next generation. So I think that, again, what it comes back to is courage and leadership. I want to be honest with people and not promise them things that I can't deliver on. So the districts are very powerful. Districts in
Mhm.
South Carolina have a lot of autonomy in how they pursue policies. They are controlled by their local school boards. And as many of your listeners have found out, a lot of times local school boards aren't really about local control because they're not really listening to the people who elected them to be there in the first place, which is
Mhm.
why those local school board elections are so important, as we have found out during COVID. But what the superintendent can do is be courageous in saying what needs to be done, in laying out the vision for where we need to go, and then in building the team to get there. So I believe as superintendent, what I would have done is work with the General Assembly, work with the governor, instead of working against them as my opponent did, to reopen schools, to
Mhm.
figure out how are we going to push districts in the right direction, to eliminate those mask mandates. It should be a parent's decision what their child does, whether that comes to a vaccine or a mask. That is not the role of the school district to decide. And so I think that really it's all about leadership and about laying out a vision for where we need to go and then building the team that it takes to get there.
Using that bully pulpit.
Yes.
That really, yeah, I agree, especially with home rule being the law of the land in South Carolina, whether it's, city councils or school boards. Home rule is the law of the land, and really that I think you're right. The goal of that statewide position is to use the bully pulpit and try and bring people towards the solution, and that's not what happened.
That's right. And the General Assembly, really is the boss of this state. They hold a
Yes.
lot of power. And so ultimately, anything that happens to incentivize or force a district to do something is going to have to probably start with the General Assembly. But again, that takes the superintendent who's working in coordination with the General Assembly to lay out the vision for what needs to happen.
So you brought up the learning loss. The learning loss over the past 2 years we're only beginning to see some numbers come out about that. Speech impediments because of the masking and not being able to see teachers and people in those positions speak, not being able to see their mouth move, has
Mhm.
caused speech impediments to almost triple, I think is what the numbers were. I'll double check that. The depression, clinical depression from isolation of children,
Mhm.
especially when they reach middle school and high school. Antisocial behavior is huge. And then on top of that, South Carolina was already not doing too great in the reading, writing, and arithmetic areas, right? So, is there a plan to try and help these students make up for all of that learning loss? Is there something that you guys maybe have in the works to kind of help combat that?
I think it's really going to take a very coordinated strategy. And I am not certain right now that the level of coordination that is necessary is actually being applied. So, districts were required to submit plans for how they were going to combat learning loss. I just received a report in a meeting that I was in, I guess it was earlier this week. No, maybe it was last week. I've lost track of time. I'm not sure
Yeah,
what day
I'm
it is,
sure.
but maybe it was this week. But anyway, looking at the spending of the federal funds that came down. And I was just struck at how few of those funds have been spent on any kind of learning loss. There's a lot that have been spent on air purification systems and on, infrastructure for buildings. But, in terms of the targeted learning loss, I'm not sure that the correct percentage has been spent. And again, to your point, the mental health of students, right? What are we doing to support these students? And again, I want to be really clear when we're talking about mental health in the school situation, these are decisions that have to be made in close coordination and consultation with parents, right? Like parents have got to be engaged in these conversations. This is not the school taking away autonomy or making medical mental health decisions for children. We've got to figure out how we engage parents deeply in this process to support their children in so many of those things that you were referencing that we've seen because of COVID. So it's going to take an all hands on deck effort. I think a lot about, the Marshall Plan that it took to rebuild Europe. And I think it's going to basically take a Marshall Plan to rebuild education in this state. And it is going to require all of us to be involved. When I have been out speaking to people on the campaign trail, I've said, I'm not just asking you for your vote on June 28th. I'm asking you for your volunteerism after, because we are all going to have to go into our schools, because right now, you were talking about antisocial behavior. Our teachers are so tired, and the discipline issues that they are dealing with in the classroom, and many times feeling unsupported in those discipline issues because of what I call defensive discipline that administrators feel like they have to practice because they're scared of civil rights violation, reporting with the federal government, right? So under the Obama administration, there were a lot of changes to how we do discipline. And some of it was probably necessary, but others of it was really based on kind of this worldview that we were talking about before, that's very much driven by kind of a woke social justice kind of mentality. And so that has upended discipline in our public education system. And so it really is going to take the involvement of the community. I think, real practically speaking, there was a group in Louisiana called Dads on Duty. Where they had, I think 21 arrests in a couple of weeks in the school. And the dads in the community said, enough is enough. We're going to go start walking the halls of the school and helping the teachers and the administrators enforce discipline. And that's the kind of community engagement that we've got to have. We have retired teachers who don't want to go back to work full time, but maybe they could come into the classroom and tutor or support another teacher who's working full time, right? Mm-hmm. There are ways that we can harness and engage the community. Or I think about veterans who are very facile at handling a weapon, right? So could they come in some kind of support role if they are highly trained to help harden the infrastructure of our schools, right? There are a lot of different ideas like that I think we have to talk about, but it's going to be an all hands on deck effort.
It's interesting you said that. I've spoken with one of the guys who was involved in that down in Louisiana, and I think they are doing some amazing stuff. There's actually one group, a man named Shakim Aket. He runs the Community Resource Center down here in the Low Country, and they do conflict resolution classes in some of the schools. And it has been, I've never seen anything like it. These troubled kids come in there and they teach this conflict resolution and how to work through your emotions instead of acting on them. And it has turned these kids' lives around.
That's awesome.
Kind of a pilot program maybe to think about. I really do. I think that's really key, right? You've got these kids that a lot of them come from these communities and these places where acting on your emotions is the norm, or these homes even. And learning to work through that in conjunction with the parents, like you said, that will change a whole generation. Truly, I think you're right.
That's right. And the public education system can't fix the family breakdown that we have seen for generations now, but we can be intentional about trying to help support and build capacity in families through engagement in the school process. I think about what they're doing down in Charleston at the Meeting Street schools, where they offer financial literacy courses for parents. and different avenues for parents to be engaged. Because I think in a lot of these communities, I hear all the time, well, those parents just don't care. They're not involved. And I think that's a really condescending position, first of all, but I think it's also a really dramatic oversimplification of the dynamics that are at play, because a lot of times these parents were failed by the same education system that's failing their children and their parents before them. And so there are deep cycles of mistrust in the education system. School was maybe seen as a place of shame or of bullying or of, any other number of other things. And so, when in education, we're talking to these parents in jargon, and, it takes, like a PhD to be able to decipher what you're even talking about. I've spoken many times to parents of children with special needs and what they go through in that IEP process. And it's not that the people in the system don't want to be helpful, but it's that their hands have been tied by so many just bureaucratic boxes that they have to check, that it just becomes a nightmare. And I have some very highly educated friends who have children with special needs, and they feel like they are just overwhelmed by the system. I can't imagine what it would be like for a parent who's maybe working 2 or 3 jobs just to keep food on the table, trying to navigate this system. So, I mean, that's really my goal as superintendent, is to figure out how we empower parents, how we empower teachers, how we empower the community to cut through so many of these layers of just box checking and bureaucracy that we've put on our public education system.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. You talked about the jargon. We see a lot of times, we've seen where parents are trying to have these conversations about what they want or what they need from the education system, and certain administration and even, I hate to say it, but some of the activist teachers even will use jargon as a weapon, that specialized jargon. CRT isn't in the curriculum because the curriculum is this specifically written out document that we give to the administrators every year. And it's like, what we mean, you're trying to use that to belittle the point. And I think that that's created a pretty wide divide, not only in education, but in political and administrative bureaucracy. That divide between that and the people has been made pretty large over the past few years through that weaponization of jargon.
I agree. And I think that probably the biggest challenge, I mean, there's many challenges the next superintendent is going to face. And it's overwhelming to think about doing the job without the support of the people of this state. It's an impossible job if you don't build that support. But I really think one of the biggest challenges is rebuilding trust. Trust has been fundamentally broken. I think we've broken trust with teachers. I think we've broken trust with parents. And we've certainly broken trust with students for a very long time. And so figuring out how we rebuild those conversations to get parents and teachers pulling in the same direction again, and to reframe conversations around, accountability, or what I call responsibility, right? Like, we have a responsibility to deliver an education to these students for the massive amount of taxpayer dollars that we are investing. Like, how do we rebuild those conversations in a way that is supportive and encouraging of growth, and not something that teachers are afraid that they are being singled out for punishment? You know what I mean? There is so much culture change that has to happen in these conversations. And so that's going to be a huge challenge. It really is. But I think it starts with, like we talked about at the beginning, it starts with conversation. It starts with sitting down, listening to people, truly hearing their perspectives, and then kind of trying to figure out, okay, how do we build the game plan forward from here to account for those perspectives?
Right. So if you got time, just a couple more things. You talked about trust and kind of transparency and things like that. So there are a couple of things that we saw going around within the past couple weeks where your name was on a couple of websites. Okay. Mm-hmm. And one of them was the governor's school of South Carolina. which there are a lot of board members there. There are a lot of people involved in the governor's school, but the governor's school talks about, and a lot of their things that they put out to people, they'll use some of that jargon, that woke jargon. Sorry to make some of the Democrats mad out there, but woke jargon is what it is. They talk about the DEI, they talk about critical theory, they talk about inclusion and giving one race more opportunities than another, and et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. It goes on and on and on their website. And you were appointed to the board.
Mhm.
So can we talk about that a little bit? So what was your role as one of the, it was ex officio board member, right?
That's right.
Which means a non-voting board member. What was your role there? Are you still on the board there? If not, when was all that?
Yep. So no, I sit as an ex officio member of the governor's school based on my role at the Education Oversight Committee. So the EOC, sorry to use jargon, but that's the Education Oversight Committee. The EOC has a permanent ex officio slot on that board. And so I have sat in that slot for several years. And I'll be honest with you, sitting in that and listening to the conversations is one of the reasons why I feel so strongly about this run for superintendent, because I do know what is going on in the schools, and I don't think that it is helpful or necessary for our children. And so, as one non-voting member of a board, you can't change the policy of an entire organization. And I think one point that I'd love your listeners to walk away with is that we need more conservatives to serve on these boards. The only way we're ever going to change anything is if people of good sense and good faith get involved. And so I would just encourage your audience to not get caught up in what I call guilt by association tactics. We have real problems to deal with, and we need to be united as conservatives in order to deal with them. And so, I would say that it's just critically important that we not make it punitive for conservatives to serve on these organizations,
right?
Because we need more people, not fewer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually does make sense. We talk about needing conservatives on school boards, but then we will say that, oh, this person was on a school board that did this terrible thing, and therefore they're not a conservative, even if they voted against it, even if they were the loudest voices against it. We saw some of that with some of the best state reps in our state, or at least the most conservative, being attacked for being a part of the legislature when certain things were passed, even though they were the only people speaking out against it or fighting it. That does blow my mind. I think that, I think you have a really good point there.
Well,
so
and I was going to say real quick too.
Yeah.
I mean, I have expressed my opposition to these things to my fellow board members. So I've not been silent on the issue and just, sitting there twiddling my thumbs. I mean, they knew very clearly what my position was. So.
Yeah, I'm sure that's, we've seen their attacks, so I'm sure that they were very aware. How does the EOC pick the person who will be on that board?
That was
that position.
In that position, that was a nomination from the former chairman of the EOC. So he designated me as his representative to that board, and it was done because, first of all, I'm from Greenville and the school's in Greenville. And then secondly, I don't know, most people may not know, I was actually a piano performance major my first semester of college. So the arts is something that I have cared very deeply about for a really long time. I quickly got out of piano performance because I realized that, practicing the piano for 25 hours a week was not how I wanted to spend the rest of my life. I do it because I love it, not because I have to do it. So I still get to play the piano at my church on occasion, and I'm very involved in our music ministry there, but that's just a personal passion of mine.
That's all. My grandmother, one of my grandmothers, she was a piano teacher her whole life. And by the time she was probably 70, her fingers. Oh, she was just in constant pain. So I feel you.
Yeah,
Don't want to
yeah,
do
yeah.
that constantly.
Don't want to do that. But I love it. It's great stress relief after a long day to be able to come home and play. And I love being able to serve with it. So we actually
Yeah.
have a special needs Sunday school class at my church that I've led the music for several years. So it's great to have a skill you feel like you can give back.
That's absolutely, it's all, yeah, all about that. And then the other thing, the Global Leadership Coalition Advisory Committee. That was the other thing that people, apparently there are some globalist 501c3s that have donated to that group. And since you were nominated to the advisory committee, and I looked at the list from South Carolina, a lot of conservatives are on it. There are some Democrats on it too. John Tecklenburg is one of them, the mayor of Charleston. But this advisory committee, can you tell me what the Global Leadership Coalition is, what the advisory committee did ever, and how you went about getting your name taken off? Because I know that we had talked about this earlier. You had asked them to take your name off quite some time ago. They never did, and it just was kind of left alone until somebody picked this up and ran with it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I became associated with the organization, like you said, with kind of a broad swath of people from South Carolina. I think about 10 years ago, I had a good friend I knew from my political days who was going around asking people to be part of this organization that essentially promotes foreign policy in a peaceful manner.
Okay.
Saying that, there are nonprofits and things that can engage in foreign countries that are in many ways far more effective than military intervention, right?
Okay.
And so that's kind of the general gist of it. The advisory committee that they put together, I mean, you've seen it, it's pages long. We've
Mhm.
never met, we've never done anything as a committee. I think they literally just wanted people who were known in the community to serve on a list and be affiliated with the organization. So, when I agreed to have my name listed, there were so many other people who I knew and trusted who were having their name listed too. I really didn't think twice about it.
Mhm.
And so when I became aware of some of the problems, like you mentioned, from some of the funders of the organization, I just said, hey, can y'all take my name off? And I never really followed up on it again, because again, I just haven't been involved in the organization. I mean,
Okay.
there's no meetings. I mean, no formal role or anything that I've ever had with it. So when it surfaced again in the campaign that my name was still on that list, I called the office and said, okay, y'all, I asked for this. I actually meant it. Please take my name off the list. And so they
Okay.
did. And so my name is no longer there. But again, I think back to your point, it's really funny what people pick up on, because, if anyone truly believes that someone who has spent their life working for conservative causes is in the pocket of George Soros, I think they may need to evaluate their perspective a little bit.
Valid. That's valid. And again, it's one of those things where, like you said, it was kind of this. I've been offered these, here, let us put your name on this as a sponsor and this and that. I can promise you, I've looked at the other people who were involved, and I'm like, okay, I like that guy. I trust that person. I trust that person. But I've never gone into their financial records to see who donated to their nonprofit, especially if their nonprofit is doing good things or
Right.
whatever the case may be. So great, we got that covered. Last thing I want to talk to you about is school choice.
Yes.
School choice is definitely a hot topic between parents, teachers, administrators, and various bureaucracies around the state. And it has a lot of pushback at a federal level also. I know from listening to your speeches and you answering these questions that you are for school choice. My question is, how how can you convince people, especially teachers and administrators, who are adamantly against this? How can you convince them that this might actually be beneficial to them as well?
That's a great question. I like to say that experience is really the best teacher. And so I think as we experience what more robust choices look like, there's just a gradual acclimation, people becoming aware that, not only is school choice about giving families and students an option to get into the best environment for them, but it also creates a marketplace for teacher talent. Teachers right now really have very limited choices about where they can apply and use their services if they are working in education. And so I look at a state like Florida, and again, experience, right? This isn't just some kind of wild haired idea that,
Right.
somebody just dreamed up. There are other states that have been experimenting with this choice question for a couple of decades now. So Florida has some of the oldest and largest choice programs in the country. And they've done, empirical research of student outcomes down there. And in communities that have the highest concentration of choices, both public and private. So when I say private choices, I mean choices where, whether it's a special needs student or a low income student, they are able to go to a private school with a state funded scholarship. Where those choices are most prevalent, students in public education are doing better. And that is the power of competition. But, to me, it also comes down to like we were talking about before, teachers. I was at an incredible charter school in the upstate a few months back. And this school is serving primarily Title I, lower income children. And they are now one of the top elementary schools in the state. They've been in existence for 3 years, and they are one of the top elementary schools in the state. And like with so much else in life, it all comes down to leadership. They have an incredible principal. And so I was talking to their principal saying, what's your secret sauce? And, she was telling me some of the things that they do there. And she said she had 2 teachers come in for interviews from a traditional school setting. And she said those teachers during their interview broke down and cried and said, I didn't think a public school like this existed anywhere anymore.
Wow.
And so teachers are hungry for choices and options too. Mm-hmm. And so I think if we can have this conversation with teachers directly outside of the filter of their associations and unions, they can be led to see the rationality of this and how it benefits them. But unfortunately, they've been lied to. And it all comes down to preserving power and money in the current system. We know that national unions are never going to let go of their power and their money without a fight. So that's really where the source, I think, of a lot of this school choice opposition comes from. And I think it comes back to just having unfiltered conversations with teachers about how choice can help them.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that filter of, there's something that I say to people a lot, and it really comes down to, you wouldn't trust somebody's enemy to give you an honest opinion of that person. That's never going to happen. And it works, and you can extrapolate that. You would never expect a union who base their entire existence and all of the stake that they hold in a system to ever give you the truth about the thing that's going to take down that system or hurt that system.
Or be perceived to hurt that system, because again, we've seen in reality, it doesn't hurt public education. Public schools in Florida are still
I meant
thriving.
the union, definitely not public education, but the power holders within that monopoly, right?
That's right.
They're the ones putting out the messaging. So honest conversations that are unfiltered. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that's about everything that I have.
Right.
I really appreciate you sitting down to talk to us. Is there anything else that you want to tell the people? Do we know when the primary or when the runoff is happening?
Yes, the runoff is Tuesday, June the 28th, and it is going to be critically important that if you consider yourself a conservative Republican, or even just a Republican,
Yeah.
you come out and vote in that primary, because there are appeals going out as we speak to encourage Democrats to vote in that runoff against me. And so it is going to take every single one of us going to the polls. We cannot sit this one out if we care about the future of education, if we care about the future of the country, because that is really what is at stake here in our education system, are the hearts and the minds of the children of this state and this country. And so if you want someone who is a truth-telling leader, who will lead with integrity and transparency and common sense conservatism, then I am your candidate, hands down. So I would just please ask you to get out and vote on June 28th, and to take your family and friends with you, because we are going to need everyone to show back up again.
Okay, great. Well, good luck to you, and thank you. And to the people out there, even if you did not vote in the primary, you can vote in the runoff. The only people that are not going to be allowed to vote in the runoff are people that voted Democrat in the primary. So that means that, yes, a lot of Democrats are being asked. We've put out proof on this platform of that happening. They're asking Democrats to vote for Kathy Manis. And speaking as a representative of at least a couple of conservatives out there, I can say that Kathy Manis, like I said, wanted no part in answering any questions. And at the very least, Ellen Weaver will give you the time. If you have some questions, she'll be there to at least bring you into the office and talk to you and work things out in a real way. And that is more than I can say for most elected officials. So
Corey, that's a ringing endorsement for sure.
It is something else out there, man. I'll tell you what. And I hope that you can help us as we try to change that culture in society and politics. Thank you once again for joining us. And my name's Corey Allen, guys. This is Ellen Weaver, and this is the Overton Report.